Okay, now we are recording, and I know there was not a recording last week. Sorry for that, but we're still working out the kinks. Really nice to see everybody, and I'm going to get us underway right away. And I'm going to start just by giving you a sense of where we are and what we have to cover. And as you may recollect, last week we spent a lot of time really reviewing everything that we've talked about together in this class so far. And this class has been going on for a couple months, so I think it made sense to spend that time making sure that we're all on the same page, all have digested the same material, because we're about to embark on an entirely different unit in the class. And one way I'll talk about this is to say that we're going to get prescriptive, right? We're going to start talking about what we should do about inequality, given that we have
mute everybody.
Okay, sorry. Let me do that right away. Thanks for the reminder. I guess I'm still figuring things out myself. Okay, so everybody is muted, and as you're well aware, feel free to interject whenever you would like. The way to do that is simply by holding your spacebar down. So let me just say what I was starting to say, which is that we're going to become prescriptive for the next few weeks. And by that, I mean, we're going to talk about what we should do about inequality. And I'm operating on the assumption that I have provided abundant evidence, because there is absolute clarity about this, that our society is growing much more unequal, and that this is not something that we are powerless to do something about. At least the evidence from the middle of the 20th century, the last, the 30 years after World War II, is that we can, in fact, mitigate inequality, not bring about a perfectly equal society, but a much more equal society than the one that was characteristic of the Gilded Age, and much more equal than we are at right now. And so I know some of you are pragmatists, and you want to know, what can we do here and now? What policies can we adopt? And that's where we're going. Before we get there, I want to do two things. And one of them is to drill down a little bit philosophically. And I hope you'll bear with me as I do this. And my reason for doing this is twofold. The first is, and here I'll refer to one of the books that I'm going to be talking about with you in detail, and we've talked a little bit about together before, One Another's Equals by Jeremy Waldron. The Basis of Human Equality is the subtitle of the book. And on page 35 of the book, he says the following, having basically said that almost every contemporary moral and political philosopher believes that we have to show equal concern and respect for all human beings. And he notes that this is really a development of the last 100 years. Prior to that, much moral and political philosophy believed that there were fundamental differences in kind and status in humanity, such that a European did not need to treat a Native American or an African with the same respect that they treated a fellow European, or that a member of the aristocracy or nobility certainly didn't need to treat a fief or a serf with the same level of respect that they showed to their peers, right? But for the last 100 years, we've been on what Ronald Dworkin, whose book Sovereign Virtue is one of the most fundamentally important works in the egalitarian movement in contemporary philosophy. This is called the theory and practice of equality. He says all of this philosophy inhabits an egalitarian plateau now. We all agree on the importance of equality. But Waldron then, having noted this, says the following: but being beyond controversy is not the same thing as being fully explicated. Embracing a position is one thing. Elaborating, articulating, and understanding it is another. I really do think philosophers have the task of explicating things that everybody else has the luxury of taking for granted. Let me stop for a second. That term explicating is a term of art in contemporary philosophy, and you may hear explicit as the root word. So to explicate is to take something that is implicit and make it explicit in order to examine it, and if it warrants defense, to defend it. And so we may all be implicit egalitarians. We may even be committed to core principles of equality, but can we state explicitly and thoroughly defend the core conviction that all human beings are equal? And that's where Waldron thinks philosophy still has work to do, as he continues. An area of inquiry does not become philosophy until people have seen reason to throw its fundamental presuppositions into doubt, at least for the purposes of deeper understanding. So in today's lecture, what I want to do, in a sense, is ask, why should we care about equality? And if we do, what kinds of inequality do we have moral reasons to object to? So those are the big questions for today's lecture. And that will then lead into next week's lecture. And you may have noticed that next Saturday is the 4th of July. And so I'm going to take a little swerve and focus on the document that the 4th of July is known throughout this country for. And that is the Declaration of Independence. And the fundamental claim in the Declaration of Independence is that all men, or as we would say now, all persons, are created equal. And so I'm going to look at that principle as a way of celebrating the 4th of July with you. And then the week after that and the week after that, I'm going to look at public policy finally. If we're really convinced that our society has become too unequal, that there are good moral and political principles that lead us to object to that. It's not just our squeamishness. And that this, in a sense, represents a hallowed American tradition of fighting for equality. What can we do in 2020 and 2021 about equality? And I'll just say this ever so briefly, and maybe we can return to this. Like many of you, I've been inspired by the protests that have broken out across this country over the last month, 5 weeks now. The killing of George Floyd by the Minneapolis police is the catalyst that brought this on. But I think at a deeper level, what we're seeing is a national outcry. An outpouring of people saying, we need to rededicate ourselves to equality. And racial equality is one dimension of this. And in a sense, as I'll say when we get further into the lecture, I think the Trump presidency reflects a group of people who feel that they've been left out of the American economy and the goods it's generated, and who demanded, in a sense, special consideration, that their aims had been neglected for too long, and they were going to rise up and demand that they continue to command attention. But the way in which it was articulated by Donald Trump was primarily in an us versus them, Republicans versus Democrats, and frankly, far too often, whites versus immigrants or African Americans. And we have a large number of people in this society right now rising up and saying, that's not all right. Yes, if we're working class, if we feel like the economy has moved in a direction that's fundamentally rendered us vulnerable and is deeply unfair, we demand that you pay attention to us. But we're not demanding that you pay attention to us exclusively. We also need you to pay attention to those who are suffering from violence at the hands of the police if that's happening disproportionately. We also need you to be having a just and humane immigration policy, et cetera, right? And we've seen advances, not uniform, but from the Supreme Court in the politics of our street to do with immigration, to do with gay, lesbian, bisexual, transsexual, queer rights. And of course, we're beginning to see some real progress on issues of race as well. And so I want to say that it makes sense to be doing this here and now and to be asking, okay, we're building some political momentum going into an election year. What kinds of public policies, assuming that we get a change in power, should we ask so that we can actually build on this momentum in a way that generates lasting change, as opposed to a cycle of protest, amelioration, going back to normal and more protest. All right, so that's what I want to be doing with you over the next few weeks. Let me now give you some more formal information about it in the form of an outline. And so a little bit of a sense of where we've been and where we're going. We've spent a long time on economics, and then we shifted into a more sociological and psychological perspective. We looked at deaths of despair. I'm moving fast, but that's because we spent much of last week reviewing this material together, and I want to get into the new material this week. We also looked at Wilkinson and Pickett and their central thesis that it's inequality and not wealth that is predicting social health in richer countries. And we looked at some of the mechanisms explaining both deaths of despair and why it is that inequality makes a society less healthy. With deaths of despair, we noted it's not just economic precariousness, but a sense of threat to social status and standing, that work for the working class was what secured their sense of being fully contributing members of society and being respected and valued for the work that they did. And when that work went away, stable, unionized jobs in manufacturing that secured economic mobility, when those jobs went away and were replaced by much worse forms of work, or alternatively no work at all, they felt not only that their economic standing had been undermined, but also that their sense of social belonging and integration was threatened. Similarly, with Wilkinson and Pickett, the way in which inequality generates higher rates of mortality, shortened life expectancy, greater obesity, greater bullying at school, lower test scores. All of this has to do not only with what's happening to the worst off in society, who Case and Deaton really focus on, but what's happening to everyone in a more unequal society, and to the fact that in a more unequal society, we all become more sensitive to our relative standing within a social hierarchy. And we look for status differentials, and we're constantly sensitive to being evaluated by others. And that kind of status sensitivity and anxiety, it turns out, is fundamentally unhealthy for us, both psychologically and physiologically. It leads to stress, and the stress produces hormones, and those hormones damage the body as well as the psyche. So that's what we've covered in short, and I hope it gives us good reason to believe that not only have we become more unequal, but we've got good grounds to be worried about our rising inequality. Now I want to shift us methodologically again. So we've started in economics and then looked at globalization and changes in the nature of the economy and work. Then we looked at deaths of despair, sociology, psychology, public health. Now I want to take us into philosophy and to do our best to make sure not only do we believe that people, human beings as such, deserve equal concern and respect, but there are good arguments to support that position and to defend that position against criticism. And so philosophy will allow us to do this. And I want to take you through, in particular, two important philosophical works that I know we've discussed together before. I believe that both in terms of the significance of these works, it merits returning to them. Also in terms of our ability to drill a little deeper into them in the context of a long lecture series, it's worthwhile returning to the works by Jeremy Waldron, One Another's Equal, The Basis of Human Equality, and T.M. Scanlon, Why Does Inequality Matter? And so I'm going to take you through the project of each of these books, the approach or school of thought that it belongs to, and the central arguments from these two books. And so let me start by introducing you to Jeremy Waldron. Jeremy Waldron is from New Zealand, but as a young man in his early 20s, having completed a law degree in New Zealand, he traveled to Oxford to study philosophy, and in a sense has basically not returned, at least professionally, to New Zealand. After getting his degree in England in philosophy and doing a little bit of work in philosophy in England, he took up a position at the University of California, Berkeley, an institution I believe some of you have some familiarity with. You may know that they created a doctoral program in social policy and jurisprudence. That program was created, I believe, in the late 1980s, and Jeremy Waldron was the first head of that program and appointed jointly in the law school and the political science department, and also teaching out of the philosophy department. And what I want to, I'll just briefly then say, after a couple decades teaching at Berkeley, he moved to Columbia University. From Columbia University, he moved back to Oxford, where he was the Chichely Professor of Political Theory at Oxford University, widely regarded as being the most important or esteemed position in political philosophy in the English-speaking world, and that reflects his stature. And then he actually returned to New York, to NYU, where he's jointly appointed in philosophy and the law school. And I'll just say something for a moment about his reason for returning, because I think it maybe illuminates him as a person. He returned from Oxford to New York, I'm told, primarily because he missed his congregation. He's an Anglican or Episcopalian in the American context. And he was very fond of a church community that he belonged to in New York, and determined, even though he had the most esteemed position in philosophy in the English-speaking world, that it was more important to him to be in that community. And so he returned to a very nice position at NYU. He has, and I want to focus on 3 of the roughly 10 books he's written. And I think these books form a troika in a sense. The first one is God, Locke, and Equality, and this was published a little bit more than a decade ago. And in it, he makes an argument that John Locke, and I'm sure most of you are familiar already, John Locke, the author of the 2 treatises on government, was the single most influential figure on the founders of the American Republic, the drafters of the Constitution. Jefferson, who we'll be talking about next week, when he penned the words, "All men are created equal," was drawing exclusively on Locke. And Locke is really among the most important originators of the modern idea of equality. And Waldron was interested in surveying and analyzing and plumbing the depths of Locke's commitment to equality, but he was also, as the title reveals, interested in a second question, which is, can you argue in the 17th century for equality without grounding your argument in theology, and in particular for Locke, Christian Protestant theology? And Waldron's answer was absolutely not. That whereas those of us today who inhabit the egalitarian plateau may take equality for granted, in Locke's historical moment, far from being taken for granted, hierarchy was the widely accepted, in a sense, obvious position in philosophy and law, that there were differences in kind between persons that resulted in their having different rights, in having different treatment under the law. And when Locke made the radical argument that all people are equal, in order to be able to persuade his audience to this effect, he needed something more than philosophy, right? Philosophy wasn't going to cut it. And of course, he was speaking to a very religious, very Christian audience. It's worthwhile noting there was a lot of what's called millenarianism in the 17th century. Sorry, but that simply means belief that the second coming of Christ is near to hand. And so that the millennium, or the salvation of all souls is near to hand. And so it was a very religious moment, but as important, Waldron suggests, it's not just kind of meeting your audience halfway or where they are. It's also, if you're going to try to introduce a radically new proposition, you need to have the deepest and most authoritative argument for it. And in the 17th century, that argument was a theological or a religious argument. Now, pushing forward to a book that he published just a few years ago, and as you may be able to see, these are the Berkeley Tanner lectures. These are lectures that were given at UC Berkeley, I believe 4 years ago, and published about 2 years ago, on dignity, rank, and rights. And in this book, he's much more in the legal philosophical vein, and arguing that you need the concept of dignity to make sense of the Anglo legal tradition's emphasis on the idea of rights, and more generally to make sense of the idea of human rights. And so that there's a hidden center of gravity to this whole discourse about rights, and that has to do with the idea of equal dignity. And this is something then that is hostile to the idea of ranking within humankind. And this then leads to the most recent publication, something that came out just a little bit more than a year ago, the book One Another's Equals, The Basis of Human Equality. This is also a series of lectures, these given at Cambridge University, and this is the book that I'm going to focus on today. So let me get into the argument, and I given you a brief introduction to Waldron and his recent work on equality. Let me then start with the idea of basic equality and its challenge. The idea of basic equality is, I think, best understood, as Waldron suggests, by contrasting it with surface level equality. And so on the surface, right, you look around and you see significant differences between people. You're taller and I'm shorter. You sing well and I can't hold a tone to save my life, right? And maybe I speak well in public and you have a hard time doing that. Maybe you're strong and can run right up that ladder and I've got a weak back, et cetera, and so on, right? So on the surface level, looking at humanity, we are not equal. Some of us are smarter, some of us are stronger, some of us are more emotionally sensitive, others of us are more artistic, and that's in part what makes humanity so interesting, is that we are diverse. By the way, we could begin to get into the fact that you come from a Christian religious tradition. I come from a Jewish background. Maybe you come from Europe or Asia or Africa. I come from the Americas, but North America, not South America, right? There are not only physical differences or differences in capability and skill, there are also differences in cultural background and differences in political views, etc. So one of the questions is, well, on what basis do you then suggest that people are equal? And this then gets us to this idea of basic equality or deep equality, which is to suggest that there is something about all human beings that, if you will, transcends their differences. Or to put it differently, the differences embellish our humanity, but don't constitute our humanity. And there are certain things about every human being as such that make them deserving of equal concern and respect, right? And you'll see that's in quotations here. I'll remind you again that that's Ronald Dworkin's phrase, and Jeremy Waldron repeatedly acknowledges his deep debt to Dworkin's thinking. And what the treatment as equals means is obviously not equal treatment. I think back to being in the Sky Room with you, right? And at the end of the lecture, most of us crowd into the elevator. Some of us take the stairs, right? And those of us who are able to take the stairs, that's fine and well. But we certainly shouldn't think that because we can take the stairs, it's appropriate to ask everybody to take the stairs. Oh, let's just eliminate the elevators. They're expensive and we're looking to save money, right? And that would treat everybody equally, right? That would be equal treatment. Everybody takes the stairs, except not everybody can take the stairs, right? And so sometimes treating someone as an equal, showing equal concern and respect for them, involves treating them differently, right? And that's in part getting at this basic respect. If you are not religious, and I know you're not religious, I can ask you for a favor on Sunday morning or Saturday afternoon or Friday, and I'm not imposing. But if I know that you are religious and that's a period of time when you consider it important to be practicing your faith, then I am being disrespectful if I ask you to do something at that moment, right? And so getting at this idea that treating someone as an equal involves having some sensitivity to who they are, and what they need, as opposed to simply doing the same thing to every person, is essential. And then similarly, and again, this is just kind of getting our toes wet right now about the kinds of distinctions we need to be thinking about as we get into deep or basic equality. When we pay complex attention to equal interests, that may require also paying attention to surface inequalities and not giving everyone equal treatment in a different respect. And the example that Waldron uses here is the fire brigade. His New Zealand background is showing through. I think we would call this the fire department. But the basic idea is, what do we want from the fire department, right? We want people who are strong. That they have to be able to physically, sometimes forcibly, enter a burning building. We want them to be cool and collected and brave, and we can probably keep enumerating, have good judgment, etc. Right? And so not everybody has all of those skills, right? And so if we were to confuse equality with equal treatment, we might say, well, we should just have a lottery to figure out who that wants to should be on the fire brigade. But if we did that, then the fire department would not be able to do its work, right? It would get to a burning house and not everybody would be able to actually carry the hose, climb the ladder, break down the door, rescue someone if they need rescuing. And so if we pay attention to the interests that are served by the social positions we acknowledge as being legitimate and important, we're going to want to select people for the position of being a surgeon who have the dexterity and the mastery of biology and physiology that we need from a surgeon. Yeah, similarly, for our professors, we're going to want people who have mastery of their subject matter. For our nurses, we're going to want people who are caring but also qualified, right? And so we should not confuse equality with mere uniformity. So this gets us to then the question of why Waldron is now focusing on basic equality and thinks that it's important that philosophy focus on basic equality at this moment. And he suggests that there are two reasons we should be doing this here and now. The first is that it is an essential commitment of anyone who considers themselves to be an egalitarian. And obviously Waldron wrote this book before the recent wave of mass protests, but he nevertheless believes that most people consider themselves to be egalitarians. And so we need to be able to be articulate. We need to be able to defend our commitment to equality. And this is particularly the case because equality is increasingly challenged and counterfactual. That is to say, even though we all say we are egalitarians, or at least many of us do, we increasingly live in a world of growing and extreme inequality. And he points out that when you live in a more unequal society, it becomes easier to lose track of your commitment to egalitarianism. That in particular, as you see greater and greater disparities in income and wealth, there's a strong temptation to say, well, if there's that much inequality, it must be that the people who are doing well deserve it and the people who aren't doing well don't. And to put it a still more basic way, if in a sense the core challenge of being an egalitarian is perceiving the humanity of the other, right? Looking at another person and it might be a homeless person, or it might be somebody who is racially different from you, or it might be somebody from the opposite political extreme as you, and saying, yeah, there's some fundamental differences in our situations, but underneath that all, I have to say that this is another human being who deserves my equal concern and respect. Waldron suggests that that gets harder as we become a more unequal society. And he leaves that proposition just as a general observation. I would suggest to you that in light of what we've studied with Wilkinson and Pickett and Case and Deaton in economics and public health, we've got a better sense for what's going on here. That in a more unequal society, we pay more attention to status markers and ways of differentiating ourselves from each other than we do to things that unite us and suggest to us that we're all in this together, because those hierarchies become more important. And so this is another reason to focus on basic equality in a moment where we are growing increasingly unequal, is to remind ourselves of our common humanity and its moral implications. So the next issue that Waldron calls our attention to is, as a legal scholar, that there is a long history of what he calls sortal statuses in law and politics. And to be clear, he suggests that there's a distinction between conditional and sortal statuses. So a conditional status difference is that Waldron is not a citizen of the United States. He's retained his New Zealand citizenship, and that means that he is treated differently in this society because he's in a different condition. He has a visa that allows him to work and live here, but that does not give him, for instance, the right to vote. And that doesn't say that he's a different sort of human being, just that he's in a different condition. Whereas there are also sortal statuses, which says, in a sense, they're just fundamentally different kinds or sorts of human beings, and that should be reflected in the law. And Waldron points out, for the vast majority of human history, we have had those kinds of status differences in the law. Most fundamentally, the difference between slave and freeman, and as that very vocabulary reflects, the difference between man and woman, right? Where the free man is the only full legal person. And if you are either unfree or not male, you are denied full rights of personhood, right? And so to illustrate this, Waldron points to the Reverend Hastings Rashtel, who was actually the person who occupied the position at Oxford that Waldron occupied roughly a century later. He occupied it at the beginning of the 20th century. Waldron occupied that position at the beginning of the 21st century. And Rashtel made the argument that the difference between a European and an African or an Asian was similar to the difference between a human and an animal. That there were differences in kind within humanity that paralleled, in his view, the hierarchy of species. And Waldron focuses on this relatively obscure man, the Reverend Hastings Randall, in part because he's a 20th century figure. This wasn't that long ago, right? And in part because he's a reverend, right? An Anglican minister, someone who, in a sense, from a theological point of view, perhaps should know better. And in part also because he's a professor of moral and political philosophy. Again, he seems to have all of the advantages to help him see equality, and yet he can't. And so Waldron, in a sense, is reminding us that although we may take equality for granted or view it as intuitively compelling to such a degree that we don't need to defend it, this has not been the case for most of human history and until quite recently. And so for this reason, we need to counter racial and status discontinuities, as well as I would argue gender discontinuities and sexuality discontinuities. Anytime anyone says there is something about another human being that differentiates them from us, and that factor that differentiates them is more important than our common humanity, we need to have an argument. And this is not a mere academic exercise. I don't need to point out, I don't believe, that an argument like this was used by Adolf Hitler and by the genocidal Nazi regime to justify the killing of millions of people in the middle of the last century. That an argument like this was used in the United States up through the last third of the 20th century to justify Jim Crow, segregation, disenfranchisement, but also residential segregation in the Northeastern and Midwestern, and yes, the Western United States, right? And so this is part of our history, and in certain respects, as we read about people refusing to go see race cars because they can't fly the Confederate flag, or nooses being put in African Americans' garages because of the same controversy, we've got to recognize that this is not simply an artifact in the Museum of History. This is something that we need to be prepared to counter. And I believe Waldron gives us some of the resources with which to do that. So let me then start by introducing Waldron's central proposition. And this is from page 3 of this book that I'm sharing with you. Dignity, I believe, is best understood as a status term. It refers to the standing of human beings in the great scheme of things, their status as persons who command a high level of concern and respect. The basis of our equal dignity as human is supposed to be something fundamental about us that makes it important for us to accord equal moral consideration to one another and to respect each other in the same way. And so, having shared that quotation with you, I want to highlight 2 ideas here for a moment. The first is that what we are committed to, one way of expressing this at least, when we're committed to equality, is the idea that every human being has the status of dignity, right? And that this is then what we need to perceive when we perceive the humanity of the other, that they too are a person and therefore deserve to be treated in a way that is compatible with their underlying dignity. And so that in a sense, what we can ask of the person who is a racist or a sexist or a homophobe or a xenophobe is, what is it that disqualifies this person from the standing, the status of being treated with dignity, right? And I think just having that clear, in a sense, immediately puts the other person on the defensive in terms of trying to explain why it is that they don't believe that all humans merit dignity, or that it's all right to treat some in ways that violate their dignity. But just as it gives us certain resources, it also begs certain questions, right? The basis of equal dignity is something fundamental about us. Okay, what is it, right? What is it that makes us all deserving of treatment in ways that are compatible with our intrinsic dignity? And in a sense, that's the inquiry that Waldron launches in this work. And now I'm going to get down into the weeds for a few minutes to talk with you about how Waldron answers that question. And I'm going to start with the idea of, sorry for the jargon, obviously my spell check didn't like it, prescriptivity. And this is just a fancy way of saying something is prescribed or that something is required, right? And a better way of putting this is that equality is a commanding value. So there are some values, the value of a good meal or admiring a important or exquisite work of art, that you might say, well, they're values, right? You know, that it's great to have a nice meal. It's wonderful to be able to see in person a work by Velázquez, etc., right? But that doesn't mean that I have to lead my life ordered around having good meals or admiring great art. That there's nothing that is commanding about that value. Whereas Waldron would say, if you understand the grounds for thinking that all human beings are equal, you are required to treat everyone as having equal dignity and standing. It's a value that once you understand it, prescribes or commands certain kinds of treatment and prohibits other kinds of treatment. And so it's a special kind of value that requires more of us. And we need to be able to understand that in order to then understand the kind of grounding that this value requires. And he suggests that prescriptive principles like this need to be grounded in facts, right? We need to have some understanding of the nature of the thing in the world that makes us commanded to follow or respect this value. And in this case, what he thinks we need to understand is our nature and what in our nature makes us equal. And so he refers to two different kinds of ways of thinking about this. One would be a target description. And a target description represents a kind of aspiration. So that the 14th Amendment to the US Constitution prescribes equal treatment and due process under the law at a time when those who authored the amendment knew that that was absolutely inapplicable for African Americans who had just been freed from slavery. But nevertheless, they wrote it into an amendment into the Constitution as a target, and they put it in descriptive language, right? This is the legal standing of all people in the United States, right? And so sometimes a description indicates an aspiration. That's a good thing to do, but that's not the kind of grounding that Waldron thinks equality requires. As opposed to that, he thinks it has to be a descriptive characteristic, something that you can actually look into yourself or into your partner, your parent, your child, your friend, and see, right? And so the challenge is not just to have an aspiration that all people are equal, but to find attributes in light of which we think all people are equal. And this leads Waldron to focus on what he calls range properties. And to be clear, the challenge that Waldron is facing up to is the challenge with which I began the lecture, which is that we are obviously, in important respects, not equal to each other. And that's not just because you sing well and I don't, or because I speak well and you don't, right? It's because even with the attributes that we might think are essential to equality, and Waldron has specified dignity, and I think it's quite obvious. Well, let me be a little bit more tentative about that. To me, in my life, I have encountered people who have a certain dignity to them, which kind of shines through, which you immediately perceive and which in a sense is impressive. And I've encountered other people who don't carry themselves in that way, and it doesn't matter to them. They're certainly not trying to project it, and it doesn't seem to be as apparent on the surface to them. So even that basic characteristic of dignity may be present in varying degrees in people. And what Waldron is suggesting is that almost every human attribute that we would want to point to in saying this is what makes human beings equal is in fact present in varying degrees in different human beings. And so this leads to this concept of range properties. And let's talk about the capacity to feel affection for others as an example of a range property, just to get the concept straight. And so there are people sometimes referred to as empaths, people who are very sensitive, have very high emotional intelligence. They walk into a room and they immediately notice that somebody is upset or not their usual self. And it might be that the person's husband or child has not noticed that the person is upset, but the empath immediately can discern. And, you know, it might be the facial expression, the body carriage, the way they're speaking, a faraway look. There are clearly people who have a stronger emotional sensitivity and receptivity. And there are others among us who are, you know, leather-skinned about this stuff. We just don't notice until somebody bangs us over the head and says, how can you not have figured out that I'm upset and what I'm upset about? I've not been talking to you for 3 days. You know, I'm sorry, right? And so there's a range of degrees to which we are emotionally sensitive to each other. But even the person who's leather-skinned, who fails in certain respects to be responsive in the way that we want them to be, if you were to say to them, I'm not your friend anymore, or I don't love you anymore, or you know, cut them off from the people that they have affection with, of course they would be hurt, they would be wounded. To deprive them of the opportunity to have relations of affection with others, even though they're not on the high end of the spectrum, is nevertheless damaging for them. And so we can say on the one hand that there's a range, and on the other hand, that almost every human being who doesn't have some kind of personality disorder, deficiency, injury, gets over the minimum threshold that this is an attribute that matters to them, and matters to them in a way that requires a moral sensitivity on our part in how we treat them, right? And so getting to the range properties is important, because on the one hand, it says we don't have to treat everybody exactly the same because there are relevant differences. And on the other hand, we do have to recognize the equal dignity of all human beings. So that's what we're looking for, is some of these range properties. And then these are the range properties that Waldron nominates as being present in the literature on equality and relevant to defending equality in the 21st century. I've already begun to talk about the capacity to feel affection for others. And this is a fundamental human attribute. We see it in the human infant from a very young age. We see it in the advanced stages of dementia. We see it among people who have various forms of mental retardation. And obviously we see it among each other, right? And so friendship is important. Love is important. filial relationships with parents and children and aunts and uncles and grandparents. All of these matter. There's a saying that I did not grow up hearing, but I read about in some of the texts I read. That person is some mother's child. And it's a way of asserting equality by saying somebody feels affection for that person. You may not have a lot of respect for that person. You may not be impressed with that person. You may actually find what they're doing to be quite reprehensible. Remember, somebody loves that person as their mother, right? And you know, there's another way of expressing this, which I think is a little bit different. There, but for the grace of God, go I. That's a kind of position that says we are all subject to random luck and fate. But another thing you can say is we are all feeling persons. And there are people who care about us and people who we care about. And we need to take that into account. We need to be sensitive in dealing with that with each other. And since we all have the relevant minimum capacity for affection, moral respect and concern requires that we pay attention to this. Right, so that's the form of the argument and the first illustration. Let me get quickly into the second capacity, and there, as you can see, actually not that many that Waldron outlines here, but a second capacity is a capacity for reason. And he notes different ways in which the capacity for reason is present and or defended or noticed. And he starts with the Stoic and Christian theological traditions. And the Stoics, you may remember, ancient Greek and Roman, the first what they called cosmopolitans, right? And that meant that they did not think in the way that many people in the ancient world thought, that you could show equal concern and respect for your fellow citizens and then be absolutely rapacious, destructive, unrestrained in your treatment of, quote, barbarians, of those who were not like you, did not come from your community. And the Stoics said, no, we actually have to treat the world as if it was one community, not as if we only owe concern to the members of our own community. And they said the reason is because even though those people have a different religion, speak different language, have different customs, they all have reason. And I think it's worthwhile noting that, right, Judaism, from which Christianity springs, is a particularistic religion. There are members of the tribe. God has a relationship with a particular people, the Jews, and then there's everybody else. And one of the things that the Christians do is to universalize religion, right? And they do it by incorporating this Stoic idea that God has endowed each of us with reason, in part so that we can understand his creation, right? And so Waldron is suggesting that historically there's a continuity between the Stoic and the Christian universal accounts of the presence of reason in all humanity and the need to therefore treat all human beings equally. Another closely related idea is a capacity for personhood. And this is an idea that each of us has an awareness of our own personality, of our own identity, of our own projects as being ours and as, in a sense, emanating from our choices and our specific identity in the world, and the way in which that identity is constituted through our choices. And even though there are vast differences in the degree to which individuals are free to create their own identity, culture to culture, historical moment to historical moment, society to society. It seems to be, if you will, an anthropological universal, that all persons recognize themselves as bearers of particular identities. And so this would be another thing that reason does for us, is allow us to fashion a sense of our own identity. Another attribute is the ability to command language. And obviously, I'm in the middle of a complex lecture on philosophy. Actually, you'll be relieved to hear close to the end of it. What I'm doing is using my words and my language to outline some rather complex ideas. And it may be that not everybody can give a complex lecture in philosophy, but all of us can use language, and use language to convey our intentions, our interests, our needs, our desires to each other, and to interpret ourselves and each other to ourselves and each other, right? And so we are fundamentally language using beings. That goes back to Aristotle's definition of what makes a human being a human being. And again, some of us are more articulate, some of us are less articulate, but we all use language in these ways. Finally, practical reason, and this is using reason to determine what we owe ourselves and each other, to set our ends and to limit ourselves by concerns of ethics and morality. And so this shades over very quickly into moral reasoning. Again, Waldron, following in a rich philosophical tradition, suggests while there may be huge differences in the morality of different societies, different cultures, different periods, all human beings, you can see, have some kind of moral compass. Or if they don't, then they become psychopaths. And in a sense, every human culture is frightened of that kind of human being. Final couple ideas here: personal autonomy, the ability to lead your life from within, to set your own goals, to create your own morality, to fashion a life for yourself. Again, we see this in all of humanity, certain traditions suggest. And then another very important influence on Waldron, the contemporary political philosopher John Rawls, suggests, in a sense, we can bring two of these ideas together. One of them is that everybody has a sense of justice, a capacity to figure out what we owe to each other, what's right, what's fair, and then a capacity for the good, a capacity to say, this is what I want out of my life. This is what's going to make my life satisfying for me. It's got to be a challenging life. It's got to be a life filled with love, etc. Right? We can fill that out in different ways, but if we formalize it, what we recognize is that every person is saying to themselves in one way or another, this is what is going to make life valuable or worth living for me. And then Waldron concludes by asking a question that I'll return to a little bit later. Would the case be strengthened if we also said, as right, the Christian theologians said, that God has equipped us with these capacities and has done so because we're made in his image? And I'm going to leave that as a question for right now. I've spoken for a long time. You've been quiet and attentive, and I appreciate that, but I definitely want to give you an opportunity to ask questions as well. So I hope the basic approach that Waldron is taking here is clear. He's suggesting that there's a good list of reasons to think that all human beings have capacities to a sufficient degree that they qualify for treatment as intrinsically dignified. They have affections, and so you can't disregard their emotions or their connections to other people. They have reason. And so you can't simply treat them like furniture or rocks, manipulate them. You have to ask them, is this okay with you? Can you accept this argument? They have morality. And so you need to be able to persuade them that what you want them to do is the right thing, or at least the permitted thing for them to do. And maybe they have both of these things together, a sense of justice and a capacity for the good. And you have to be able to say to them, it's both just and in your interest for you to do the following, not to be on the fire department, even though you really want to, because you don't have the requisite abilities and because what we need from the fire department is the following. And on the other hand, it's absolutely incompatible with justice or with caring about somebody's understanding of the good to put their children in a detention facility on the border, even if they have come into this country illegally. And so this is an argument that indicates the way in which we can ground this intuition that we are all equal. I will stop there and open it up for questions. I'm going to unmute everyone, so recognize that now everybody is also going to be able to hear you. Give me just a moment to unmute. Okay, we're all unmuted, and I'm seeing that there's one thing in the chat. Let me see, from John Campbell. Where do we draw the line between respect and concern for citizens and foreigners? Just the right to vote? How many rights are bestowed by the state rather than by God? Or are these ideas of common humanity you are speaking of? Well, that's an easy question, John. So let me say that in a sense, Waldron's not interested. And so I don't mean to be dismissive or even blunt. Let me explain why he's not interested in these kinds of arguments. And the reason is because there's a huge literature on them already. And so I can speak to that literature a little bit, but what Waldron wants to say has been neglected in the literature on equality is the grounds for equality, the basis for equality, and that's where he's going to concentrate. And whether once we understand that, that makes us cosmopolitans and we say there's absolutely no good reason to treat citizens differently from foreigners, or it leads us to be liberal nationalists, right? We need to maintain the borders precisely so we can maintain our welfare state, right? A lot of distance between those two positions. Waldron says, you know, I'm not going to try to settle that dispute in the context of this argument. What matters is that we recognize everyone as having intrinsic dignity and that we therefore have the need to treat all persons with equal respect and concern. And whether that means we can also erect borders and keep foreigners out and not do anything for them, or it means we have to tear down the borders and let everybody in, is a topic for another day. So that's Waldron's position. But having said that, I recognize that probably that's not very satisfactory.
Oh, it's fine.
And so let me just say for a moment that for Waldron, the idea of basic equality is what he's concentrated on in this work, but is not something that is absent or that lacks implications on these kinds of questions. And so one of the things you would have to ask is, okay, so I owe equal respect and concern to all persons. How can I show it? What is required of me? Is it compatible with recognizing the equal respect and concern of all persons to also say, I've got differential obligations to citizens as opposed to other people? Because with citizens, we share the same political community, the same history. We're part of a cooperating society. And those people in that other country, I may have some obligations to them, but they're not the same as the obligations I have to citizens. That would make you maybe a liberal nationalist, right? That is to say, you're not going to disregard human rights violations. And if there's a natural disaster, you're going to offer aid to those persons, but you're not going to suggest that they have simple freedom to enter your society, or that you owe the same thing to them as other citizens. And I'm not saying that that's the right position, but I'm saying it's important to see that one can be a deep egalitarian, believe that every human being deserves equality and respect, without automatically becoming a cosmopolitan and saying we can't have special duties to our children or our loved ones or fellow citizens. That's not a direct implication of being a deep egalitarian automatically. I hope that helps, John, and feel free to follow up, but also if anybody else wants to ask a question, feel free to jump in.
Too deep for me.
Who said that? Too deep for me. So I gave a version of this lecture a while back, and one of the comments I heard was, I feel like I just went to temple. So yeah, these are deep arguments, but they're also essential arguments, right? And so we're in a moment where people are in the streets and arguing for the basic equal rights of fellow citizens. We're also in a moment where the president is going to rallies and using racially tinged language to talk about the origins of the coronavirus, right? And so we need to be able to marshal our resources. And let me just say a little bit more about this. And I hope this wasn't just an academic exercise. I do think this matters, and matters in practical ways, which is to say, if we're going to convince more and more people, and I showed you some data last week that suggested that younger Republicans are more concerned about African Americans and police violence than our older Republicans. And so one thing you might say is, well, we'll just wait this out, right? We'll just wait for the younger Republicans to come of age and they'll be more reasonable. But I think a better world is a world in which we succeed in actually addressing the other side, the side that we believe is deeply problematic and in a sense immoral, unjust in what they believe and who they support and the kinds of policies they want to impose, that we need to be able to say to them, look, you're fellow citizens and we want to be able to offer you arguments. Here's an argument about why equality matters, why equality requires that we treat every person with equal concern and respect, fundamental human dignity. And if you don't accept that argument, will you please tell me, is it because you don't believe that those people feel human affection, that those people have human reason, that those people use language, that those people have a morality, that those people have plans for their life that matter to them? If you're not denying any of that, on what grounds are you suggesting that they don't deserve the same concern and respect that you deserve? And to be able to, in a sense, do the really hard work of transforming our political culture to be a more egalitarian culture. This is work that Jefferson, as I'll try to argue, set us on our way with 225 odd years ago. This is work that Lincoln and Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Martin Luther King Jr. tried to further. And each of them, I would suggest to you, found it necessary to use philosophical, moral, religious language to address the country. And it may be that we need to find the courage to go deep on these issues in the current historical moment, notwithstanding how divided we are and how bad public discourse is in our society right now. And so that's the reason for taking us into philosophy this week.
Hmm.
Anybody else? I'm justifying myself. I'd love to hear questions, thoughts, concerns.
Doris.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead, Doris. I thought I heard you asking a question. Am I wrong?
Hmm.
I think you just
Where are you
muted
headed?
yourself.
Can you hear me?
Going to mail.
Now I can hear you. Go ahead.
Oh, I don't know whether it's a question that I'm asking, but somehow I got a little confused. What if you don't come from a Judeo-Christian background? Can you understand this?
So that's a really good question, and there's no reason to think of that as a confusion. So Waldron has asked a question. If you remember at the outline, I posed it as a question. Does a theological worldview help to deepen your commitment to equality? And we'll see a little bit into the coming weeks that he actually thinks that it does. That what he calls a theological anthropology, in which you believe that all people are created equal, does deepen your understanding and appreciation of equality. But having said that, he doesn't believe it's necessary. And so I think that's the fundamental distinction. Now, having said that, you know, I speak to you as somebody who studies Western political philosophy, and in the context of a knowledge that we all live in the United States in the 21st century. And so if I tried to make this argument in a different cultural context, it might be harder. It might be that there would be less in common. It might be that I would have to use different examples or to unpack the argument using a different history and different cultural reference. But Waldron believes, and I do too, that this is not a culturally specific argument. That this is an argument that ultimately anyone from any cultural situation should be able to appreciate. Now, whether that means that they will automatically jump on board and say, I believe in equal human rights, I believe racism is wrong, I believe sexism is wrong, I believe homophobia and xenophobia need to be abolished. Thank you for explaining that to me. It's not that easy, obviously, right? And so if you become convinced of a principle, but that principle contradicts a whole bunch of other things that you believe, very few of us are Saul on the road to Damascus, and we just, on a dime, change our whole value system. But slowly but surely over time, perhaps that demonstration that this is a valid principle does some work, succeeds in getting us to bit by bit change our minds. By the way, it works even better across generations. And so in a sense, what one can hope is that the mobility of a doctrine like the doctrine of human rights, which says that every human being has certain rights simply by dint of being a human being, begins to take hold. And it will require translation. It will require that it be embedded in different cultural contexts in different ways. And Waldron is not doing that work for us. He probably lacks the ability, as certainly I do. And in a sense, it goes much better if there are, if you will, dissidents within their own culture. Ai Weiwei in China is somebody I would point to as being someone who says, you know, I'm Chinese, but I'm also now convinced in the equal dignity of all human beings. And what that implies is that at points I'm going to have to be dissident from my own culture and from my own society, its politics, its laws. I would suggest to you that it works better when the person making this argument makes the argument within their own culture, as opposed to it being somebody from the outside saying to those others, you guys are all wrong. Let me explain to you why. So does that begin to make sense, Doris? Okay. Can you hear me okay?
I'm not sure whether that answers, that's an answer for my question or statement. I guess, would you say, can you hear me?
I can hear you just fine, yes.
Would you say that Waldron's philosophy is universal?
So let me be careful, and thank you for clarifying the question. I would say that Waldron's philosophy aspires to be universal, in the sense that he believes he is pointing to features of human nature as such that demand that we treat all human beings with a fundamental equality and sensitivity to their standing as dignified beings, right?
But that's because theologically it comes from the whole foundation that man was created in the image of God.
So good, thank you. And let me say back to that. No, I don't think that is what Waldron is saying. And to be clear, Waldron believes that someone like John Locke took this idea out of his theology and translated it into secular discourse in the form of philosophy and the legal tradition around individual rights. Now, does that mean that philosophy and secular discourse completely leave their cultural origins behind? Obviously not, right? You need to, if you're going to start saying this is no longer an exclusively religious argument, I've translated it into a discourse that no longer relies on your accepting my religion, but tries to use the tools of philosophy to make this argument in a way that anybody who has reason and understanding can begin to evaluate and be convinced by. Well, yeah, if you came from the same theological background that I did, that's going to be a lot easier for you, right? And if you come from a very different theological background, or if you've completely rejected religion as such, you're an atheist or agnostic, then it's going to be even more difficult for you, maybe. But the move here is a move to say we no longer need the theology. The theology is part of the origin story. It helps maybe to provide some greater depth, but it's not something that we have to rely on exclusively. And John points out, I'm looking at the chat bar now, that some of us would include animals, or at least some animals. And I think you're absolutely right, John. And so can animals feel affection? You know, what we see elephants and whales do with their children certainly suggests yes. Can animals reason? Yes, in certain respects it appears. Do they use language? Right, you know, and so what do we mean by language? Do whales use language? Maybe they do. And so we would have to begin to ask, to what degree are animals analogous to us in the relevant respects? To what degree do they pass the threshold? And you might say that you don't believe that animals have the same right to health care, that human beings have, but that doesn't mean that you simply get to treat animals like objects, right? Which is to say, to kill them and eat them, for instance, because they have no moral standing whatsoever. So this might admit of degrees, that they don't get up to the same threshold that human beings do, but they don't fall down so low that they're like rocks or inanimate objects. Well, I'm just seeing the time. We've gone on for almost an hour and a half today, which is great. I certainly am happy to share the whole morning with you, as we often do when I'm there in person. But I am going to get back to the other stuff I have to do today. So I'm going to say so long, and we'll be together next week for something rather different, a reflection on the Declaration of Independence, and in particular on the idea that all people are created equal. Take care, everybody.
Oh, wonderful.
Thank
I'll
you.
bring the firecrackers.
Thank you, John.
David. Thanks,
Bye,
David.
everybody. Take
Bye.
care. Thank
Bye.
you.